Yeah, I'm really worried about dropping because the rain here, it's not raining up there.
Not yet.
In any case, if nature is on our side and on the side of ethics and philosophy, I'll be consistently here. And if it's not, we'll know that we're saying something we ought not to. So welcome to Be Better Club, right? So today the topic of conversation is going to be in particular, I mean, it's continuing this theme of democracy. But today I had a podcast, which maybe some of y'all listen to, talking about majority rule and the idea of one person, one vote. Largely, if you listen, I don't know, did you guys get a chance to hear it? Or
Yeah.
okay, perfect. I mean, then you know that the reality is it's one person, one vote, but it's actually much more like, okay, how could we understand what one person, one vote is, and what sort of different institutional mechanisms might, alter the reality of saying we have one person, one vote. In particular, I think this is why I have it after well, I think I know because I planned it. This is why I had it after the political equality discussion. I think one of the questions, right, is okay, if we think something like one person, one vote is important, in what sense can we actualize it? So that interviewee, from Tufts, she regularly is talking about the fact that like it's not like there's one mathematically fair model that we can offer here. And so we're often needing to make choices about what the values are that we want to realize. Classic balances between majority rule, minority rule, protecting minority interests, maybe those sorts of considerations. And then the same sorts of, I think, discussions that came up about, I don't know, gerrymandering or the Senate or electoral college, that sort of stuff. I think our lenses for this discussion, but because this is a philosophy or not podcast discussion, I think the particularly interesting thing is to think about, okay, well, what are the values that we would care about, and then use that lens to try and push us through to a discussion of, okay, well, given that we want to realize equality in this way, or assuming we want to, I don't know, does having the district model, is that a good way to do it, or should we have these citywide, electoral schemes so that we have a town council that's large groups? The other discussion I think that's going to be particularly interesting for us today, and though we can go wherever we want to go. Oh, Steve's just coming in.
Alex.
Is thinking about the role of things like maybe ranked choice voting, or other sort of mechanisms or models that would alter how elections are carried out, and so essentially altering the very weight of a vote in some way, right? I think if there's one thing that I'm just going to tell you is the case that we should learn from this lesson, it's that it's not like as simple that there's obviously one path that tells us here's how one person, one vote is realized. These are contested questions, and that's why I think even though we might have our opinions about how to best realize that, sometimes we have to stand on our values and justify, okay, this is how equality ought to be realized. So this is how democracy ought to be realized. And with that, and as normal, does anyone want to jump in and with thoughts they had? Because the best discussion is one that goes where folks are interested, I think.
Well, I think we have to keep in mind that our democracy is regional. In other words, the paradigm set up for the national elections is different than for state and local. So when you're talking about one man, one vote, it depends on where you are and which particular system you're voting in. If you're talking just for president, which most people think about when you're talking about one man, one vote, that their mind goes right to, the presidential election. But you got to keep in mind, democracy is bigger than that. You have, election for governors, elections for mayors, election for school board members, city commissioners. So yeah, it's spread out, and you need to take all that into account.
Yeah. And actually, I think that's one of the discussions that we've kind of come to a few times in this term, is thinking about trying to think of democracy as wider than just this one presidential election every 4 years or whatever. And so that fits. Also, Alex, I made you co-host here in West Palm Beach. It's raining a lot and my connection is very unstable. And so if I drop, I don't want the meeting to close. And then, yeah. Other thoughts on what Stephen has brought up?
Well, so I think this is kind of related. Um, the the interviewee brought up this notion that I had never really considered before, at least for the United States, lotocracy.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that there's some sort of random element, some sort of lottery elements to the elections. And my first thought was, what scale could this be implemented if this could be implemented in the United States? Where would this be most successful? Would this be a good way to do primaries? Would this be a good way to do the presidential election? Good way to do judges, regional And I think that kind of gets to Stephen's point about the different, at least spatial scales of what we're talking about when we're talking about voting.
Yeah. Actually, I want to flag two things about that. First is, I think one thing we might think about that you just brought to our attention is the way in which a suggestion for how to maybe alter elections taking place. It might be that there's not one size fits all. It might be that what system we use for primaries might be, autocracy or something. And maybe we want a different one for presidential elections, or maybe we want different things for municipal versus state versus federal. The other thing is, I'll say I have a stalled paper from like years ago on autocracy. So I definitely, if we want to get into that discussion, I'm happy to have it and set a little bit of ground rules, or not ground rules, some foundations for having a useful discussion there. I'm interested in autocracy. But as you can see, I think that if you recall from the podcast, the interviewee, she's not moved by it. She thinks there's some concerns there, but yeah. Other thoughts that as we start the discussion, and then maybe we can pick up on some things and get a little bit deeper, but I want to get some stuff on the table. Alex or Steve, yeah.
I don't know how relevant it is, especially to the podcast or the topic, but we do tend to speak from our own context. So I'm speaking from the context of a U.S. citizen, and we live in a representational democracy, which is very different from one person, one vote in many cases. We elect congressional leaders who vote and then make decisions. So in that sense, we don't have a direct vote opportunity on many important public policy issues and funding issues. So we like to think of ourselves as in a democracy, which we are, but in a particular form of democracy, and one where we rely upon represented leaders to, represent our voice in a kind of an ensemble way. And sometimes we don't like the way that they decide, to operate. And there's a tension there because it could well be they're more informed than us in some cases. It could be that they're very ill-informed. And allowing their personal values rather than their constituent opinion to drive how they act. And so to me, there's a real tension between the democracy we lived in and the idealized one person, one vote sense of democracy that we often have and think we live in.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's two things. So last time, or maybe it was 2 times ago, we had a little bit of discussion of referendum and whether that was like a good thing for democracy or not. And so that gets this idea of like sort of, I think you didn't use the word, though I froze for a second, direct democracy versus, representational democracy. And then there's a question of, okay, maybe we want, as kind of going on Ian's lens here, is direct democracy appropriate in one area, but maybe not in others? Certainly, I think one of the classic problems with the direct democracy, so the idea is that I would vote directly on a policy, or we would all have this sort of direct say, is related to size, right? So sometimes people are concerned, like, look, you can't have a direct democracy of 300 odd million people or something. But maybe you can have it at a municipal level or on certain referendums or whatever. Yeah, Stephen.
Jump to Stephen.
Or actually, Steve or whoever.
No, go to Stephen and then I'll pipe in.
Okay.
There was an article in the Sentinel a while back about a republic and a democracy. And in fact, a British friend of mine and I had a little bit of a debate. He claims that the United States is not a democracy; it's a republic. Well, the article, an opinion article, said when Madison said that the U.S. was a republic and not a democracy, he meant in today's vocabulary that it was a representative democracy, but still a democracy. It's just not a one person, one vote democracy like Venezuela, which apparently is one man, one vote. So I guess we can debate about why we have a representative democracy instead of a direct democracy. So I'll just leave it there just to hear what's said on that.
No, I think, sorry, that's new transition. I got all these plants here in the audience, right? Right. So one of the questions, right? What are we trying to realize with the system? So it's not just like, oh, direct democracy is fairer in principle or something, or in the Platonic form than something like representational democracy. It's thinking about questions of right. I mean, if you have the U.S. history background, you think about balancing minority versus majority interests, right? And so that's one of the arguments, particularly Madison's concerned about. Even things that for some of us feel like obvious. So questions about whether the electoral college is legitimate, right? And one of the arguments for its purposes, it serves the interest of protecting small states so they don't just have, their voices crushed by these larger populous states. And so is that undemocratic or not dependent?
The other issue too, and I'm just jumping in fact, since it's only 5 of us, I think we can probably all just be unmuted or be respectful anyway, but this Supreme Court's ruling that corporations are also voting members in a democracy too. I think that was a terrible ruling, actually. I mean, I know arguments can be made that, you know, after all, corporations are made up of the stockholders and so on, but still, I think that's, you know, slants our democracy in the wrong direction. So that's another discussion, I guess, or part of a discussion we can have.
Yeah. Well,
I
even
I
Steve, jump in.
agree.
Yeah.
What a completely terrible ruling in so many ways, but one is that it amplifies other individuals' votes. It's no longer one person, one vote. It's one person, potentially lots of votes if they have enough equity in a company who is also counted as a vote. It's a terrible ruling, Stephen. I think it's indefensible. And I think it's a flirtation with disaster, and one that I hope we recover from. And maybe sometimes you have to go toward the abyss before you can pull away from it and go in a better place. So maybe that's just part of the natural evolution. But you do have space to evolve and to improve. And I think one of the ways to improve is to have conversations like this and really drill down, even if it might sometimes seem academic and pedantic, about what do you really mean when you say you have a democracy? Do you have a democracy because you have a vote? Well, there was always voting in Russia for the longest time, you know, even before perestroika, and that vote was meaningless. So one person, one vote is in and of itself not meaningful. At that time, in that context, the US citizens and kids in school and high school, like I was at the time, love to make the grand distinction between our democracy and how we vote versus what happens in Russia, as though we had the best democracy. But now I think in this era, we're seeing even the fragility of our democracy and how it fragments, and that it's not just having a vote, and it's not just whether your vote is actually properly counted and whether there's more than one party. It's more than that. It's actually about having a society where there's proper information exchange as opposed to disinformation promotion and exchange. We're seeing how vulnerable we are to misinformation, and we're seeing how that impacts our democracy. So democracy is about a functioning society, or a functional societal structure. It's much, much more than a vote, and it's perhaps only possible and sustainable when you have things like quality education and individuals who vet information and have an open mind.
I
Yeah.
completely agree, Steve. That's where my mind went as well, like thinking about what at the end of the day is a vote. And I don't want to diminish the importance of having the vote, right? It's meaningful for people to be able to vote, and for everyone to be able to vote and not be disenfranchised in, you know, any legal or practical way. But at the end of the day, you know, you keep hearing from the people who don't want to vote, because they don't like either option, right? Are these people really given a meaningful opportunity to contribute? And it feels like they don't really, right? Because they're just, the choices are really so restricted. So if you want something different, it's not like you have a vote, right? You might as well not vote, which a lot of people do anyway. They just don't see the point. And there are, I assume, a lot of policy people and, you know, political theorists who are trying to figure out best like ways to make this work better, and potentially ranked choice voting that was already mentioned is one of those. Potentially, you know, a parliamentary system could be a better way in terms of having more of a spread of opinions. But even those kind of systems, like when you see polarization, which is almost global at this point, you just are forced to these coalitions, even parliamentary systems that kind of weed out diversity, right? And it's almost like you have like the core of a movement that you're supporting, and it seems more likely that you're supporting that movement because you're against the opposition rather than the other way around. It's not like people are really given an opportunity to have something to stand for. And that kind of
goes to the second point that you made, Steve, the epistemic component of this, right? Like, not just whether we have information in general, but what, first of all, it seems increasingly hard to figure out what politicians are planning to do, to the point that you hear it's almost like better for them not to tell you what they're going to do for, getting elected, and convincing people to vote for them. But then it almost seems like you can't really vote in any meaningful way. How are you consenting to be governed by someone who you don't know what they're planning to do? Are you voting for an idea, a symbol, like a representative who you trust will do the right thing, even though you don't really know what they're going to do? And if, we are to trust these people, what grounds do we have to even trust them, right? I recognize my own epistemic limitations, right? And I recognize the need to have people who are experts, who spend their time thinking about these ideas, researching, etc. But it doesn't really seem like the politicians, well, don't want to generalize, but many of the politicians don't seem to either know what's going on or have enough intellectual humility to know that their ideas might be flawed, or disregard the truth completely because it doesn't really matter to them. It's a power game. So it's kind of like an awkward place where it's almost meaningless. And I'm speaking from a point here of the assumption that we have secured the one person, one vote. And that's a very important step. But beyond that, making that vote substantive and not just something that doesn't really mean much, I don't think we're anywhere close to that. So if we're going to really make that a vote, there's a lot of more work to happen.
One thing I've heard. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I did want to clarify, first of all, my statement. Then I want to pick up on what Alex just said, which is really important. Obviously, when I say corporations were, the Supreme Court gave them the vote, actually, obviously, the CEO doesn't go down to the poll and cast a vote. It just has to do with their financial support. They're treated as citizens. So, yeah, I know you all know that, but anyway, anybody else listening would need to understand that. But the other point that you really brought up, Alex, I really like, and that is politicians don't dare detail what they're really talking about, what their plan is, because when they do, obviously it's almost always some kind of compromise, and immediately the other side starts dismantling it, taking it apart, dissecting it, and in some cases, like environmentalism, even though all of us would like our politicians to pay more attention to our environmental situation, but boy, that affects such a wide spread of people. I mean, we all put gas in our cars. We care about the price of fuel and so on. We do care about the environment, but it affects different people differently. So politicians tend to speak in broader, flowery terms rather than in specifics, because once they get into specifics, they're in trouble right away with some group or another. And so, yeah, it's only after the election they start getting into specifics. So that was a really good point that you made. And so I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, one thing, just because I heard it a few times, and I feel like just to make it explicit, so one of the classic, I think, dichotomies we have, right, is, do the politicians and they're experts in ways that we're not, and so maybe that's why. And this is going back way back to Steve, your comment. Is this why we should give them, representative democracy is helpful because we have experts then who are carrying out maybe the values that I want to see, even though I say maybe I care about equality, but I don't actually know which policy is going to do the best. So maybe the politicians can do that better than me because they're experts. And then there's a question of, okay, are they ignorant when they're not doing that? I think another option I think is worth considering. This is one that sometimes comes up in this literature. There's this idea, right, that I think maybe
I think he'll come back, like he always does. But he's dropped out a few times before you guys got here, but usually it was brief.
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna try and limit my conversation to a little bit shorter because of the freezing. The key thing I wanted to bring up is there's a possibility that actually there's just different interests in play. And so there's this view called agonistic democracy as one motive. This is the idea that just what these systems are is a conflict of interest, and we're trying to get our interests to win. And so it might be that not that the politicians aren't failing because they're stupid or blah blah blah, but just they maybe have different interests than ours, or maybe that this party isn't making mistakes because they're making some mistake, they're ill-informed, but actually because their preferences, their interests, again, might be different than ours. And I think this is something that for me comes through in the lens of, the Citizens United stuff. Like this is the concern I have about it. But in the interest of, I think, having a productive discussion, I wonder if maybe just as a locus for this sort of thing, what are the things that, Citizens United, what's the charitable, the sympathetic read of what that's protecting? Because I think sometimes we misunderstand, or we're maybe a little too quick to assume here's what's going on. But maybe even using the lenses of majority rule, minority interest, blah, blah. What is it? Why is Citizens United a thing that the Supreme Court supports, or why people might vindicate or defend it, setting aside that agonistic, that sort of, okay, we have conflicts of interest, and so they just want to win? Is there ways in which we can understand that there's some democratic values at play here? Does that question make sense? Just because I noticed there's like some, or I implied agreement amongst us. Trying to think about what the other positions might be on this might help us see, I don't know, paths forward that allow for better or more stable compromise. Long-winded question. How might Citizens United actually be in some way supposed to realize democracy? Or how might we understand this disagreement not merely as a misunderstanding or stupidity or different interests?
That's a really interesting question, Josh. I might be wrong here, so please jump in if you remember the details. But as far as I remember, what Citizens United did was remove any limits to money contributions that essentially are considered speech. It was not the case that actually equated money with speech. I'm trying to remember now what that case was called. It might come back to me at some point, but if it does, I will mention that. But I think both of these cases, and in conjunction, are presumably trying to protect free speech, which is no doubt really, really important. Of course, what free speech means is, it's self-contested, right? Is all speech like supposed to be free, or is some form of speech actually violating other rights, and so should be forbidden? I will not get into that territory. But the basic idea is that money buys speech, right? If I want to communicate something and I want a broader platform, well, perhaps today it's much easier to do because I have the internet, but even to have access to the internet, that's an expense, right? In the past, especially, and even today, if I want some other form, like I want public broadcasting, I want, like to print out pamphlets and post them in public or distribute them, whatever I want to do, like that costs money. So that is the general understanding that I have. And to that extent, I think if someone were to completely ban the spending of money in politics in any sort of way that kind of, requires money as a medium to do that, they would be limiting and restricting speech, right? They would only allow speech that's free under certain conditions. And what kind of speech is really free, right? Me just going out of my house and starting to, shout to whoever happens to be around listening. So then that, and I guess, that's where the limit of my charitable interpretation of what that protects is, right? But then, when you go, and I guess that charitable interpretation kind of is somewhere justifies more so the pre-Citizens United decision that equates money with speech, and then Citizens United that makes it unlimited, lifts every cap, essentially allows vast economic inequalities to translate into speech. And there it seems that free speech really becomes distorted in many ways, right? And the reason is because, yeah, sure, like the ability of me to say something and say whatever I say it to whomever I say it through, whichever channels, whatever, in theory should be protected. But attention is a finite resource, right? And so because it's a finite resource, it almost kind of becomes a zero-sum game, that if you give too much power to some people to take on people's attention with their speech, then there's not enough for others. Assuming that, you know, those without economic resources even have the ability to reach people who they would like to reach to, and perhaps they have a right to reach to. So I think it's hard to make the case that Citizens United specifically, oh, Buckley v. Vallejo, by the way, that it just came to mind. That was the previous case that equated, I think, money with speech. But that's, I think, the reason why, to me, even though you might be able to justify Buckley, it's really hard to justify Citizens United as a decision that really has some merit in terms of the speech argument.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not a strong decision. It was a 5-4 decision. So just barely passed, and it overruled spending restrictions that dated back 100 years, actually. And the idea was that the government had a role in preventing corruption. And obviously, corporations, as powerful as they are, and other groups too, as you said, could corrupt and skew the voting, which it has done. I think that's arguably the case. I suppose the counter argument is that, well, what are corporations? Well, corporations, of course, are institutions controlled by investors, and the investors, obviously, the big difference is typically the investors only have one thing in mind, and that's profit. And so these huge corporations, of course, that's what they're voting. They're voting for profit and nothing else. You know, occasionally you'll get corporations that do have a little bit of a conscience regarding environment and things like that. But for the most part, the stockholders, they want profit. And so this is where I think some of the corruption comes in. And with big money, you have support of politicians who will support, the profit of the corporation. And I think big money, obviously, is a corrupting facility, obviously. So, anybody else?
I'm just putting it in chat because unfortunately I keep freezing. But the main idea I was trying to make was this discussion. So if we understand Citizen United as being about free speech, one, what we're going to discuss, how do we best realize free speech? What is the values or what's important about free speech? That's going to change. It's also going to change how we might respond to it. So if we happen to think free speech is important and we disagree with Citizens United, and we also assume that it's about free speech, then maybe the strategies we use are going to be different than if what we think the real distinction here is, I don't know, about protecting minority rights or protecting individual rights in a sort of strict right to free speech and money as a means of having speech versus protecting, the quality of this right or the positive means of realizing it. And so in a previous discussion, we talked a little bit about like, okay, we all have a right to vote, but I work at a university, so it's super easy for me to get the time to go to the polling place. And Alex, he works at he's a landscaper or something, and his boss is going to be kind of annoyed and maybe hold it against him. The Republican, and so I shouldn't say Republican because I meant it in political philosophy sense. One way to realize that is thinking, well, actually, we don't have the equal rights here precisely because the conditions we're under are different between me and Alex. Another way of understanding sort of the negative liberty sense is that, no, me and Alex have an equal right, and we can't, for whatever reasons, pragmatic, political, whatever, we can't, legislate trying to ensure that me and Alex have the same opportunity to realize our freedom. That would be like going too far or be too difficult to realize for a state to do it consistently, all these power concerns. But the key thing I was trying to think about is it's going to shift how we want to respond to the issue, and of course before that how we even think about the issue. I'm going to say if folks have other things to discuss, we could bring that up. Otherwise, I'm going to suggest at some point, because we're about half, we should think about, there's a possible discussion about ranked choice, and we could think about why that may or may not be an attractive means of altering our system. What values is it going to realize? Does it make us more less democratic? We could also go back to the autocracy stuff, so that the randomness, and is randomness a way of realizing political equality? We could also talk in the podcast, they talked about districts, whether those are good systems or not. You go back to previous discussions, referendums. So, but maybe think about some of the particular policy moves through this lens of what's valuable. It can be helpful. But before I do that though, any more thoughts on discussion as we've had, or things people want to get on the table before maybe we shift to considering particular policy moves?
I think real quick, expertise came up a couple times already, and I think that what we've asked for politicians over the last even just couple hundred years has changed dramatically, and I don't think there could be an expert on everything that is existing right now. And I know, like, once you get to a certain level, like the president has cabinet members to help with this and advisors. But I'm thinking about even our local politicians. They're talking about things that there's just no way they can be an expert on all of those things. And I don't think we can even expect that as a society. So now we have this idea of, drawing back to autocracy again. One of the disadvantages is you may have people put in a position of power or to make decisions who have no idea what decisions to make. But we kind of already have that. In so many ways, we have so much we're asking of both local and federal level politicians.
Yeah. Also, philosophically, logically, that's a really important thing to bring up. So it might be that, like, okay, if this is the biggest cost of autocracy, then it's important to notice, well, is that a cost that's already existing in the non-autocratic system? And then that's going to force us to discuss, the issues in a more productive way. Yeah. Steve or Alex, did you have something you want to jump in on? I saw some movements, but
The only other thing I was going to say is Citizens United also led to the formation of PACs, which also had influence based on money and unlimited money at that. So that was just another institution, I guess, that led to perhaps distorting our democracy. But the other thing you brought up, really interesting, is precincts. How do you draw maps and make them fair? So, originally that was the reason why we had, 2 senators for every state. But in the House, of course, it was, based on the number of people. So the idea, I guess, of having 2 senators is because you didn't want the more populous states to, just bowl over the less popular states. They still had their 2 senators. But on the other hand, then later on, drawing maps, there were efforts to protect African-American minorities who were just felt that they had absolutely no say-so in democracy at all. And so courts ruled, no, that maps needed to be drawn so that it preserved at least some representation for minorities. And it typically was Black minorities. Now we have all sorts of minorities. Still, that's nearly an impossible task to get that so that everybody feels that it's fairly done.
yeah. And precisely, I think, because the issue of, like, and this is what came out. That's why one of the reasons I like this podcast is the interview. And I'm just so disappointed I forgot her name. She's bringing up the point that we're often having to make choices. So one map might realize one sort of political value we have. Maybe it realizes minority interests protected a certain way, but then it's going to have certain costs for maybe making races less competitive, which then has this risk of, more extremist candidates winning. And so there's all these choices we're going to need to make. And so I think it's unfortunate because it means there's not an easy answer, but I think it's better to know how unfortunate the situation we're in than to pretend all we need to do is get, some technocratic response that will give us the mathematically fair map or something. Because I think that includes that, no, some of these discussions need to be had before we move forward here. And now I'm going to get on my hobby horse a little bit. If we're worried about people, the plurality of voters in most elections in the US is the non-voter, right? If we're worried about political participation, we want to wonder why are people not participating? Why are they feeling like their vote isn't worth it, or they're running for office is unreasonable for them, and so forth. Well, one of the reasons I think that can happen is precisely because we pretend the issue is this, sort of technocratic fairness thing or something, when in reality there is maybe some choices we need to make sometimes, or we need to be clear about what values are at stake. Yeah. other thoughts before, I think maybe we could go into the autocracy stuff a little bit. We could go into ranked choice voting. I think maybe using one of these as like a locus for discussion of these values can be helpful, because sometimes there's issues upon issues. So just like we're bouncing around and getting nowhere. I think maybe looking through the lens of a particular policy might be useful.
I think that's helpful, Josh. I was like, just to draw on something, I guess. I've been reading, like you mentioned, the Electoral College, and it's a bit of an odd system that foreigners like me don't necessarily understand 100%. But one of the interesting things about it is that most states, except for Nebraska and Maine, have a winner takes all rather than a district-based system of voting for electors. And again, this seems like a way in which the stakes of voting, like one has, you know, a right to vote, but the kind of broadening, I guess, of the scope and the winner takes all nature of voting for a state. For instance, voting in California, which no matter who you vote for will be Democratic, or voting for Texas, where no matter who you vote for will be Republican, just removes the incentive to vote, right? So if you broke it maybe down district-wise, it would certainly create different kinds of problems, the same way that, you know, gerrymandering of districts creates in local elections, but it would potentially increase the impact of one's vote, and in that way incentivize more people to participate. And then you have other policies, like in Greece, we vote on Sunday, which is a day off, right? Changing the day or making voting day a day off, or doing ranked choice voting, which means that one's opinion matters and will count more. Like thinking about all these kinds of incentives that essentially work by making people see that their vote actually has more value, is such an interesting approach to me that intuitively seems right. And I'm not, you know, in any position well qualified to distinguish between all these different options and which one's better, but I'm just bringing all these up here as ideas for thinking about, okay, if we do value one person, one vote, and I think that most, at least in principle, do value that, then what are we doing toward realizing that as much as we're able to, even though we know that we will inevitably have to make some trade-offs?
I think there's a bit of an issue with the one person, one vote, and that is voter education. So if you have a lot of ignorant people who are voting that don't really know or understand the system or what they're voting for, then you know, they may vote for things that are unwise, unreasonable. So that works only if everybody is almost equally informed. That kind of goes back to Plato, the philosopher kings of Plato, you know, or even our early history, where only the landowners could vote. And that's the reason, was because, of course, they had a stake. You know, they had the land, and so, you know, others that didn't have as much of a stake, that were not landowners, they didn't get to vote. Well, in the democracy you're talking about, Alex, you know, everybody should have a stake, but everybody needs to be educated to a certain level so that they really understand what they're voting for. They need to understand the system. They need to understand, well, you know, there's been a lot of talk about civics programs being abandoned in our high schools. And I don't know if that's true. I think to some degree it has been in the past, but I don't think sometimes we understand how important that is. How important, first of all, understanding the system, our democracy, our representative democracy, and then understanding rational thinking, critical thinking, and how to evaluate actually what you're voting for and who you're voting for. And also understand what, even more now than ever, propaganda, especially now that we have fake news, we have fake videos, we have all of that that goes on, where people can be easily fooled and people need to be educated so that when they do vote, that they can vote with wisdom and knowledge rather than just emotion.
Yeah. I want to flag October 30th. We're going to totally resolve this question Steven's bringing up because we'll be talking about the ignorant voter and possible solutions. One of the questions is, in response to this question of, or maybe this problem of an ignorant voter, is the move to require voting. And the argument there is that it's going to force people to have a reason to start educating themselves. It's going to force politicians to want to ensure they're educated, so they're not making good choices, or maybe restricting voting in a certain way. So sort of tests for being able to vote. We know how those have been used objectionably in the past because they weren't about educated voters or about disenfranchising Black folks or whatever. But there's a question of whether maybe we do that. John Stuart Mill, a politician and philosopher, had this idea of weighted voting. So maybe you get more votes based on education. So yeah, there's some stuff we'll discuss on that and figure some policy proposals. Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of like what Australia has done. I think they require everybody to vote. In other words, you're actually taxed, assuming that that you maybe not going to vote, but you get a discount when you vote. So you're incentivized to vote. I believe that's correct. If I'm wrong, but I really kind of like that idea.
A lot of countries do require. Actually, I was in Ecuador last year, and they require you to vote. And if you don't vote, you have to pay a fine. And until you pay the fine, you can't, apply for certain civil services. You can't update your passport. You can't do these sorts of things until the fine is paid. There's excuses. You can apply for like, okay, I have to be out of the country for a funeral or whatever. But yeah. What I mean, we brought the Electoral College a few times, so maybe that's the thing. We can just make the locus for discussion. But yeah, what is at stake in terms of political equality, or maybe in terms of minority interests or majority rule? How do we think about the Electoral College? I mean, sorry, we have views on it, but like trying thinking about the values there. Like, so whether or not we think yes or no on it, what do we gain? What do we lose with this sort of system? Does that question make sense?
It does. I mean, not that we have to do it here, but I think whenever there's discussions about this, people should first declare their political affiliation and then give their opinion. Because I really think people who are largely opposed to the Electoral College right now feel like they're political underdogs and it's harming them. And if the tables were turned, they would suddenly be very in favor of the Electoral College. I think that's just human nature. It's kind of sad. But I think there are some merits. Maybe I'm in the minority. I hear lots of scholars talking about the Electoral College. I think there are some merits in the principles behind which it was founded. And it can provide some advantages. It's just providing very strong disadvantages to one portion of the political spectrum in the United States right now. And I've been somewhat hungry for good, rational arguments against it. And I've heard more emotive criticism of it than anything else.
Yeah.
Maybe
Honestly, I want to flag that's a
lightning
possible. I want to flag that your suggestion here. I mean, I don't think you meant to fully as a joke, but what it identifies is this idea of like we need to think about policy choices as the incentives they create, right? And so I think that's one way the social scientists maybe that can give us an innovation here is like, okay, well, one incentive created by the Electoral College is we think about, well, how does it serve my interests or not? And so if I'm in so normally presently, though, I think this has changed in the past, right? Presently, Republicans seem to be favored by the Electoral College. Though I was reading something the other day that this seems to be diminishing. The importance of the Electoral College is kind of reduced based on other shifts. That might make us think differently about. We want to make the discussion more useful because we can be more genuine with each other. But it might also think differently about what policy suggestions we want to offer, because we need to think, well, not just what is it supposed to realize positively for us, but what incentives will this create for us if we assume we have different interests or preference, or as if we assume blah blah blah. Sorry, I jumped in too much like a teacher.
One point that I will throw out there just in response to Steve's question, I guess, and I'm not throwing it out there to provide a response or anything, but I feel like that has never been adequately justified to me, is why well, first of all, like the Electoral College seemed to be very differently, and I don't have the details again very clear in my mind, but it seemed like in the past it's almost like people didn't even need to vote. There were the electors and they were assumed to just know and go vote. At some point, maybe they weren't even necessarily required to vote for whomever they were sent to vote. I don't know if that has changed. Maybe now they have to vote for whomever the state voted. But one thing that seems oddly unjustifiable to me is the fact that really small states, what essentially the Electoral College does is by lacking proportionality, even if we do accept that there should be a set of mediators who then go and vote for the people who voted for those mediators, why this disproportionality? I don't know exactly, what that is, but like numbers of the sort. I know, for instance, that voters in small states have essentially 9 times or whatever that may be, voting power than voters in big states, which again is a problem for the one person, one vote theory. So what I don't see, I think that the burden of proof should be on people who feel like there should be some people whose votes have more weight than others to show why that is. And there might be a good justification for that. I just haven't heard it.
Does anyone feel like I feel like it might be useful genuinely. Do folks feel like they have an answer for what the justification, even if it's supposed to be? Maybe we don't buy the argument. Let's inform our barbarian, our Greek. Why? So that's unfair because everyone else is a barbarian. But why was Alex not understanding about our enlightened system here?
Something from my early history, I may be completely wrong. The idea behind the Electoral College is my previous statement that we can assume that individual voters are ignorant. They're not up to speed. They're not to be trusted. And so by having electors who are actually selected, but it is supposed to be based on a one person, one vote, but still, they're people who are up to speed, who are knowledgeable, supposedly, on the process, knowledgeable on the matters that are being voted on, and so on. And so that's why they're selected. But you're right. I think different states have different ways of doing that. In some states, it's mandatory, I think, for the electors to vote for the majority. Other states, not so. I totally agree, though, with your earlier statement about having a proportional vote rather than having one, the winner take all. I think that's just nuts. But I think most of the states do it that way. But that's my thought on why there's an electoral college, and it goes way back. Yeah, there's so many that are ignorant. They're just, they don't know what they're voting for. They're easily persuaded by emotional propaganda, whereas the electors, are selected supposedly for their knowledge about the system and what's actually being voted for.
Stephen, we may be of a similar age and so came through a similar educational process, but that's kind of consistent with what I learned in my civics American history classes. And we had some discussion about it, to the credit of maybe the Kentucky teacher that I had. She was outstanding, and was herself a politician and mayor of our town. Wonderful person. But we had discussion about it, and there was some wringing of hands and consternation among the students as we talked about and contemplated our system and how it seemed to create some elitism associated with the electoral voters, and maybe it was well intentioned and maybe it's imperfect. So even when I was taught what you were taught, we discussed its imperfection, and maybe we only conceive of systems and aspire to that perfection, and what we're stuck with is things that are quite imperfect. And so it might be hard to defend it perfectly at a time when it seems so imperfect. Again, not necessarily a response to Alex, but I traveled in Europe, lived in Europe a little bit. I really like kind of a proportional representation system like you have in a lot of parliaments, but sometimes they don't work very well. I don't think Italy's had a stable government since World War II. And right now, the so-called Ampel coalition in Germany is just fallen apart. And basically all they are united in is the opposition to the far right that's, re-emerging in Germany. These things get really messy, and you can point to times and places where a given system looks great, and you can be immersed in a time and place where a given system looks horrible, and you question, why does it exist? I'm not really sure that I buy into the electoral college as being such a disproportionate system. I'd like to hear the math, behind certain people's votes being amplified, but it is based on congressional representation, so senators and members of the House of Representatives. And so in that sense, a little state like Kentucky, where I went to high school, yes, got 2 more votes, but that pales in comparison to a more populated state like California. So California still is winning. That said, it's true, there is a power differential. And so if you look at senators, very powerful senators like Mitch McConnell, guess where they came from? Well, he's from Kentucky. They can carry extra weight, and it is extra weight that's afforded through the Senate and therefore to the Electoral College system. I can imagine where we'd say, well, that's not fair because it violates one person, one vote. And that it probably is about people, but it's also about land and space and the country. So what if, for example, this is an ill-formed model, but what if you had a lot of votes in California, as we do now, and only 2 in Montana? Could the highly populated state of California push through legislation that totally exploits Montana, and therefore our whole of union and that state suffers in terms of exploitation of its resources or whatever, if through electoral college and Senate representation, Montana didn't have much of a voice? That might not disenfranchise people because most of the people are living in California, but it disenfranchises the nation, as Montana is a state and part of our nation. A counter argument could be, oh, well, that would never happen because we all care about nature. No, we don't. We all care mostly about our income more than anything. So I'm hedging a little bit here because we pushed back against arguments that institutions like companies should have a voice and be treated, as people. And here I'm kind of advancing an argument that it's more than just people. It is states and a sense of nation and place that maybe has to, is benefited through the Electoral College and having a little more voice. But I'm not the only one that pushes arguments like this. I mean, there have been arguments that maybe rights should be afforded to animals, not a vote, but rights at least, and maybe rights should be afforded as indigenous people did to the lakes and the mountains and the streams. I mean, our sense of who has right is highly varied, and then further varied is how rights become actionable and represented in vote. And I think maybe we need to get away from just thinking about rights and voting as people and more about preservation of community writ large, even beyond political borders.
Steve, just a quick, I looked that up just because I was curious. And according to a Washington Post article that's 7 years old, it says that the least populous state, that's one example that it provides, which was Wyoming back then, with 586,000, about 586,000 residents, gets 3 electoral college votes. And California, which is the most populous state and has about 39 million, 55. And numerically, that means that each individual Wyoming vote weighs 3.6 times more than individual Californian vote. So it's significantly less than my estimation earlier, which shows my biases, I guess.
Oh, that's okay. I appreciate your self-correcting. That's the line of a good scholar. But I mean, your point's well taken. Certainly, there's an amplification factor, and it's a good argument that you make.
I want to jump into, so just because I didn't come up in precisely these terms, but maybe it's just the time when we went through the U.S. system. For me, one of the big things I remember being taught in the civics class, and we still had it when I was growing up, was this idea of tyranny of the majority being a concern that electoral colleges, so maybe not just a fear of populism or like ignorant majorities, but in particular, if there's smaller states, that this gives them a little bit more weight, a little bit more concern. And if you go take that further, I think maybe there's some sort of diversity concern here. Members of smaller states maybe having different interests than members of larger states. Presently, it happens to be a rural-urban divide, but that shifts sometimes. You might think that would be a reason why the electoral college is important. So it's a way of actually realizing a sort of interest, a democratic one, a sort of political quality that maybe wouldn't be if we didn't do that. I don't know, this is maybe a little shoehorning, but if you think about what, Greece, as a member of the EU, a smaller country, what sort of restrictions on power they had when those nasty Germans, forced some sort of structural adjustment, right? You might think, well, maybe if they had a little bit more weight based on their small size, I don't know, the thing wouldn't have been quite as objectionable for Greeks. And so maybe that's precisely what would happen to Montana or Wyoming. We would just clear cut it to serve our big California interests or whatever, our big Florida interests, get some nice mahogany. Well, we don't grow mahogany, but whatever. Ian, you had something to say, and I realized the time is running late, so I should shut up.
Well, this is actually really quick, and it's to Dr. Kluger's point. We give personhood to these entities that are not human, and there's this big movement of rights to nature. Maybe the United States' simple approach to this could just be national parks, right? National parks equal one vote, for example. And that would give some sort of protection to Montana and other states that generally have, well, except for California, generally have a smaller population. I had never considered that, but that's such an interesting idea of flipping the argument from land doesn't vote, people do, to is there a way land should have some sort of representation, the rights of nature, things like that. So I'm glad
As
that
someone from Wisconsin, I'm a little concerned about our number of national parks relative to those folks in Montana or Colorado. So but
You have 3 in Florida though now, Josh.
okay. Well, yeah, now I'm ready to shift my vote with my selfish interest that Steve was telling us to consider.
There's scads of national monuments everywhere.
Yeah.
But I think we should not go away thinking that I'm advocating that Yogi Bear should have a vote. But we definitely have to think really about what we're trying to preserve. Are we just trying to preserve the autonomy of the individual to express opinion, or we're trying to preserve the greater society and the land and the not just the people, but the whole of the nation, however you think about that. And I don't have a perfect answer, but it's definitely going to come from more discussions like this, Josh. So I appreciate you leading us.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for coming. And I'm gonna take the last word and say, I like Steve's approach and in that respect is just that it's not very interesting if we're too focused on our individual present political interests. You don't notice that who the electoral college maybe preserves or serves varies over time in merely self-interested ways. And so I think generally thinking about what values we want to realize might lead to a more consistent and stable approach to thinking about changes to the voting system. One that also I think, as you brought up the Italy case, might serve our interest if we think political stability is important, which I'm just gonna say you should, right? With that, any final thoughts, I guess, before we leave? Our next one is October 9th, by the way. We'll talk about economic democracy, so it's a little bit of an aside, and then we'll get back to the ignorant voter right before our presidential election.